Almost beyond imagination, a strange adventure into the unknown. Welcome, guys and ghouls, to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia, and with me, as always, is my father, Rocco.
Hello.
The movie we're covering in this week's episode is The Incredible Shrinking Man. So just a friendly disclaimer to start things off. This is a movie which, as you might expect, involves a man who finds himself unhappily and incredibly shrinking. Part of me thinks I'm overthinking this, but I thought I might as well be more safe than sorry. The film in question, while not being precisely bigoted, definitely doesn't handle questions of ableism or heightism in a particularly sensitive way because why would it? It was made in the 1950s. The protagonist does use the term, quote, midget and, quote, freak to describe his condition, and it occurred to me that that alone might be fairly offensive to little people or anyone else sensitive to the discrimination and lack of representation that the little person community faces, particularly when you also consider that the film does feature a supporting character who is a little person, but who, like the protagonist, is portrayed by a taller actress using trick photography to make her look like a little person. As always, I respect my audience enough to assume that they can appreciate all these elements in the context of the times in which the films are made, but frankly, I don't feel really qualified to broach those issues too deeply, so I thought I might as well give all our listeners a heads up to decide for themselves.
We'll tip our hat off to Randy Newman.
Why Randy
Short
Newman?
People? His song, Short People?
You are way more familiar with Randy Newman than I am. I only know Randy Newman because he did the Toy Story song.
Okay.
That's literally my only knowledge of him.
People are my generation would know the
you see, the
Short
only,
People song that he did. It was very popular.
Yeah, yes. You see, the only reason Randy Newman is on his mind at all is because before we were talking about Rocket Man, which is not a slog, but it is a terribly mediocre movie, and I came away from it with the bristling hot take that Elton John really isn't that great. Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting is his only good song, and, his only great song, and he's basically just a British Randy Newman, and everyone's a little too excited over him.
Right.
But anyway, this is not a episode about Rocket Man. Although that does sound like it could have been a B movie, doesn't it?
It sure does.
I would love that's what I would have liked more than Rocket Man.
The First Man in the Moon?
Yeah,
right?
rather than a biopic about Elton John, why isn't it a jukebox musical of all Elton John songs, but like about a cosmonaut or something? The movie we are talking about today is The Incredible Shrinking Man. This is one I think that's a little closer to our hearts than the ones that we've watched before, because I think it's one that, it's the one that I've seen the most out of all the movies that you ever, whenever you were just telling me all about the movies you used to watch as a kid, of those movies, this is the one that I think I've seen the most times. And
Have you really?
I think so.
Okay.
I think it would have to be. And I'm not precisely sure why, aside from the fact that...
Well, it's on more frequently than the other films. I think that's one thing. If it's on TMC or
yeah, as a
is
kid,
that a disclaimer, or do we have to say something? No, we can't.
No.
That's all right.
There's no copyright infringement against mentioning that a network exists.
I don't want to malign it in any way.
No.
Right.
It's a good movie.
Yeah.
All of the movies, it's weird, we're talking about this on a podcast that has previously either only discussed monster movies or sort of horror movies that are at least a little bit adjacent to monster movies in some respect, whether they include like zombies or mad science or something. But The Incredible Shrinking Man is the outlier so far, because it really isn't a monster movie, is it?
No, it's not. But Who's the director on it? Is it
Jack Arnold?
Arnold. But he's done a number of other things, right, that are pretty good movies in the B classification.
Yeah.
I've remember his name on a number of things that we looked at or I've seen.
Yeah, I think for us, Monster on the Campus is another personal favorite.
See, I didn't know that. I was
ours.
thinking The Creature.
He directed that as well. He also directed The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which I have not seen. So that's something I need to catch up on. I did see one of the first sci-fi films that he directed. It Came from Outer Space, which I absolutely love. I think that's a spectacular movie, and I did have the privilege of being able to see it on the big screen, not in film, but it was digitally projected at the Princeton Garden Theater, which is a great little independent theater just a half hour away from us. So it was a great treat to be able to see one of these movies not on a television set, because it really is an altogether different experience. And I imagine that The Incredibly Shrinking Man would be an even more operatic experience.
Especially with the great photography and the sets. The set pieces look pretty nice.
It's a very well done movie, and I think part of the reason that it is so well done does have to do in some sense with the fact that the way that special effects and trick photography are utilized here are not really, they're not even in the service of something that it turns out to be that fantastical, is it? Because it's not just the absence of monsters. It's a movie that in a lot of ways does emulate a sort of all of the contemporary science fiction and sort of fantasy adventure narratives. But the setting that it chooses is one that's utterly banal, because the Incredible Shrinking Man, basic plot summary is a guy gets exposed to atomic fallout.
Plus the interaction with a previous dose of insecticide.
Yeah, that's an interesting
part.
Now we'll come to later. Yeah.
Right, we have a new kind of element. Now we have not only radiation, we have radiation interacting with something else.
Yeah.
So it brings in more of a... it's very contemporary when you think about it,
Yeah, we'll get into that a little later, and we'll really break down why that's an interesting twist for the film to have. But so he gets the condition where he just begins to shrink precipitously. The first two acts of the film are focused entirely on that. There's no real struggle, as it were. There's no fight or real action to speak of. It really is just a drama that is oriented around this speculative fiction idea of like, okay, what if this man shrinks? What does this do to his psychology? What does it do to his relationships? And then in the third act, once he gets really small, like basically the size of a rodent, suddenly it turns into an almost Robinson Crusoe style adventure.
It does seem more of an adventure,
or even Sullivan's, or even
Gulliver's Travels.
Gulliver's Travels.
Right, Gulliver's Travels.
I almost said Sullivan's Travels.
Gilbert and Sullivan's Travels. Yeah.
Gilbert and Sullivan's Travels.
It's a musical.
Yes, it's a musical. Damn you, cat! Damn you, cat! But no, and so. Yeah, it's a very odd arc for that. But once it does get into the adventure stuff, the accoutrement is because it's about the shrinking man, not this, not a sailor or an adventurer or an astronaut or a scientist or a soldier or what have you. It's just a man who's trapped in his house. So all the threats that come at him are basically his own home turning on him, and whether it's just a house cat or a spider in the basement, suddenly all of these things, those become the source. And it's weird how it is intrinsically fantastical in one sense, but there's this brute contrast between the sort of high fantasy spectacle of the end of the movie and the sheer banality of what's actually making it up.
Right. But, it's kind of funny because you see this a lot with people with infirmities. It's almost like that. When
your home becomes your prison.
Right. Your home becomes your prison, but also your trouble for you. I mean, you have to worry about trip hazards. You have to worry about things that are in various positions that when you were healthy were fine, but now can be quite dangerous or are inaccessible to you. So I think the movie has broad appeal, I think, to a lot of different concepts, in terms of what you're speaking about.
There's a lot of ways you could interpret the movie in
Yes.
terms of that.
Yeah.
Whether it's, but it is sort of a fantastic and wonderful little twist that I don't real. I mean, it's a domestically focused fantasy movie, which is just not something you see very often outside of literary science fiction. So I think that it's appropriate that the author of the movie, or the one who wrote the screenplay and also the accompanying novel, which he wrote contemporaneously to the movie, Richard Matheson, he's primarily known, I think, to a lot of people as a novelist, but he actually has had an incredibly prolific career writing for film and television, to say nothing of his literature, which has also inspired other movies and television. Just a brief survey of stuff he's written. I Am Legend in 1954. That's been adapted into a movie at least 4 times. A Stir of Echoes in 1958. For a while, he was the go-to screenwriter for Roger Corman's Edgar Allan Poe movies. He wrote The House of Usher, The Pit and the Pendulum, Tales of Terror, The Raven. He also wrote Duel, both the short story and the teleplay that was the first motion picture directed by Steven Spielberg. And that's just film and literature. He's also written extensively for shows like The Twilight Zone or The Night Gallery and even Star Trek. He was a highly prolific guy. And with The Incredible Shrinking Man, the way he tells a story is fairly iconoclastic, because you can boil down the plot of the movie to the high concept of a man shrinks and dangerous things happen to him. But ultimately, the way the movie is written is far more as a study of an internal breakdown rather than a fight against something external.
I mean, yeah, even as he shrinks, he finally comes to realization that he's still a man, so that he thinks like a man, and that he's going to have to come to grips with the challenges that he faces. It's kind of interesting how size describes the formation of that person, right? So obviously that's not too unexpected. So
a lot.
As he begins to shrink, he thinks his identity is disappearing because he's shrinking. But
which in a certain sense it is. Well, it has to, because he's only ever experienced the world in one way.
Right, that's true. But the idea is that
he's
still him.
I guess it's a little different when he first discovers he's just shrinking by inches.
Right.
And I do think you're right, because I'm thinking in terms of the entire arc of the story where he does shrink down to just the size of a bug, and then even smaller, to the point where he basically just atomically disperses into the cosmos, but his psyche remains, and he sort of, like you were describing, there's this final soliloquy that or narration that takes over the end of the movie, where he's so small that he realizes that eventually he's just going to become part of the universe, and he finds solace in that fact, and it gives him an inner peace before he dies.
Or maybe doesn't die.
Or whatever you
just
would call.
To a point where,
or transcends our material, our human conceptions. But I was thinking of it in terms of that, but what you're bringing up is that the complete collapse of his conception of self begins really early on, in terms of it's like something as simple as, it would probably be very terrifying, of course, to just find you've shrunken a foot, but at the end of the day, the movie at least doesn't dwell on the idea that he really perseveres, at least for the most part, as he's shrinking. Like, this really cripples his self-conception and his idea of self.
Right, but I always wonder whether it's a factor of his age, too. Like, if he was older, say he was 80 and he started shrinking, it sounds like it's funny, but as you get older, you don't worry about things like that. I mean, that's not...
I mean, I guess you could, like, that would be an interesting story, almost like a, you could almost imagine like a Mark Twain version of this story where it's an old man who's shrinking, but he actually loves it because he just goes around the country like parading himself as a one-man freak show. Because that is the thing in the movie, and that does become a huge part of the protagonist, whose name is Scott Carey. He's played by Grant Williams. That is a huge part of his mounting crisis, is that once he reaches 3 feet tall, which basically means he's just a little person. He's at, but he has this total sense of complete humiliation and alienation from society because he associates normal and productive and meaningful society entirely with being of, quote, normal height.
I felt puny and absurd. A ludicrous midget. Easy enough to talk of soul and spirit and essential worth, but not when you're 3 feet tall. I loathed myself. Our home, the caricature my life with Lou had become. I had to get out. I had to get away.
And so there is this scene where he goes out walking one night and he passes by a carnival barker who's parading a freak show. And of course, freak shows being what they were when they were at the height of their popularity, obviously we wouldn't call a dwarf or a little person a freak. Midget is obviously a term that's become very... Well, I think it should be more unacceptable, but it's achieved a level of being fairly unacceptable to refer to somebody as a midget. But definitely him passing the freak show and seeing this little person beside a bearded lady or the fattest man on earth, whatever it is just like that just like breaks him, and he just goes running away, and he goes to a diner. And it's really weird because we don't really see him interacting with people or people interacting with him that aren't his close family or the doctors that are trying to help him. So we really don't get a handle.
Well, he hasn't time to socialize.
Well,
I mean, you have to limit the scope of things. When he goes out in the wild, most people don't interact with the dwarf. Or
yeah.
I mean, when we went to, what's the place in New York, when we went into the washroom, There are dwarfs. There's a dwarf. Are they called? Yeah, dwarf. There's a dwarf in the men's room, and there was a dwarf in the ladies' room or the women's room. They would hand out towels to you. So talk about disconcerting. And you walk into the...
Yeah,
it's kind of funny.
I mean,
but it's not funny. But
no, it's like it. There.
But you're not.
No. We should be clear about this. Is that it's all. I think a lot of times we do talk about the obvious sexism or misogyny in these movies, the racism.
Right.
But there's obviously entirely different axioms of bigotry and discrimination that these movies always reflect, and that movies in general continue to reflect. I don't think little people or people with disabilities are meaningfully represented outside of a few typecast scenarios.
Sure.
And it's a problem. It's a problem that's persistent, and I don't want to flatten that, but I do want to emphasize that this movie, I think it's more than just he feels alienated and discriminated against because he's discriminated against. I think the fact that it is a character who started out tall but is shrinking, he has a reason to feel alienated. But it seems like his alienation doesn't because we don't really get any evidence for it, that his alienation comes from discrimination. It seems to be rooted entirely in the fact that he has become that kind of person, the person who is ignored.
Scott, people know, they realize they're not laughing at you.
They're not?
No.
Why not? It's funny, isn't it? But it is. See how funny I am? The child that looks like a man. Go on, laugh, Louise. Be like everyone else. It's all right. Well, why can't you look at me? Look at me!
It's all on him. I mean, if you were, as his counterpart says in the Carnival show, the woman that he meets.
Yeah, he meets a movie called Clarice, who's played by the actress April Kent, who I referred to previously, is a tall person actor. She's not a little person. And
right, but just make the set look.
Yeah, and it turns out that she's the one who works in the Carnival show, I think.
However, the guy that comes in, the guy with the cigar, if you noticed, he was the same guy that played the fascist in Saboteur when they do the Carnival thing.
Who's the? I don't get
the guy with the dark black hair that says, "Hey Clarice, make sure you come home. Make sure you get in soon because we're ready for the next show."
Don't be late, Clarice. I won't. Hi.
Hi.
He's actually he's actually a dwarf. He's actually a dwarf, right? He's actually in Hitchcock's Saboteur on the train ride that they take, where they have they're with a carnival, right? They're traveling with a carnival to hide from the authorities, if you remember.
So there is that bit of a representation, although it is it's more of a bit part.
Obviously, the problem with this is that when dwarfs are disproportionate in their body habitus, as you probably know.
Yeah, she does not look like she's a little. That's the only
He's
thing.
He's shrinking. That's okay to shrink proportionately.
Right. She does. It's one of those things where all the trick photography, where it is well done, it can't alleviate the sense that is clearly just a tall actress who is being shot on a big set. And it's actually pretty much the only one of the few places in the movie I feel where I felt that sense of disengagement from the spectacle, where I was like,
right, because he could have a philosophical discussion. How do you deal with it? He asks her. Deal with what? This is the world.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So she encounters him at the diner, and she already knows him because by this point his condition has basically become national headlines. And so she knows who he is, and so he asks her about how do you live as a little person. Her perspective is, well, I've been this way all my life, so I don't see anything wrong with it.
Right.
Which I suppose is, okay, at least there's that. At least there's this outside character who's like, you realize that freak is just my job. Like, I actually work. It's like, it's not, sometimes, things can be rough, but it's not the end of the world if you're a little person.
Right.
How do you live with it, Miss Bruce? What do you do?
I was born a midget. It's the way I grew up. I know it's happened to you, and, well, that's different.
I don't have the same existential dread you do. You have this existential dread because you're not she doesn't say all this, but I think it clarifies the sense of perspective from his point of view, which is that he's not a little person. He is a taller person who just happens to be shrinking, and he's bringing with him all of these internalized prejudices about what it means to be normal or what it means to be a real person.
Well, it must be people looking at him.
Right. Right.
Or ignoring him completely. Or,
exactly.
Yeah.
And that becomes a thing, is that in the way that the movie is so domestically focused, where we don't really know a lot about Scott Carey except that he's professional, middle class, affluent enough to afford a boat and go on vacation, which wasn't particularly rare back in those days. He's portrayed as an everyman sort of character, and obviously because this movie is being made in the late 50s by white filmmakers, that everyman association with him is always bound up in him being white and being a man and being in this comfortable professional and economic position where he's the breadwinner and he has the stay-at-home wife who is very dutiful to him. Once the condition begins to act upon him, because it is so domestically focused, I think it becomes even more clear that at least metaphorically, this alienation he experiences is not simply coming from his condition. That if anything, his condition is like a metaphorical realization of a social process where it is society that's becoming more alienated. It is society that is becoming less communal and more...
Oh, he's always looking. I don't know if it's any metaphor in it.
More idealizing of a suburban professional middle class lifestyle.
I know, but I don't think that. I mean, that then you get into like Edward Scissorhands, where the houses are all painted the same way on the same street, and it's all like a matte finished look to it.
Well, that's the thing. Edward Scissorhands and Edward Norton, and sorry, not Edward Norton, of Tim Burton's early movies in general are pretty much they're pastiches of the Americana of the 50s and 60s. That like the wholesomeness there is being amplified to a point of grotesquerie. I'm saying this is the root.
I know,
this is this is the sort of ideological setting that those movies are referring to and parodying.
I understand what you're saying. You think that metaphorically you can look at the film that way, and maybe you're right. I mean, I don't know, but at the same point, he's isolating himself.
Yeah.
Because of a psychological breakdown that he's having because he's shrinking. People aren't running away from him.
Right.
He's running away from them. And which is very interesting as you come to the end of the movie, he does shrink and he's happy with it. The idea he is shrinking to nothingness, not happy with it. But the point is that he comes to grips with it. So in one case, it's him that actually...
Just this unqualified misanthropy and just ultimately the greatest reward. Oh, I don't need to deal with people ever again. And they're, people always judging me.
Right. So, I mean, that's another arc in the whole thing. But, there are a lot of things you can read into it.
Yeah, it's a simple movie, but it's a very malleable one, too. There's so many different ways you can go about looking at it. So let's move on to one way that I think is another really indicative aspect of Matheson's uncommon originality when it came to him, because this was not something he was commissioned to do. He pitched this idea to the studio Universal International as he was writing the novel with the condition that he also write the screenplay. We already touched upon it, but the movie opens with Carrie and his wife on vacation. They're on a boat. While she's below deck and he's above deck, they pass through this mist, which turns out to be radioactive fallout. And as he discovers he's starting to shrink, and as he finally is able to get doctors who can corroborate, once he proves that it's not just me, I'm not just thinking that I'm shrinking, I'm not having a nervous breakdown, I really am shrinking, and they confirm it. The doctor in the movie who is attempting to cure him, Dr. Silver, he asks him if he's ever been exposed to radioactive fallout. The first thing he asks him is, have you ever been exposed to any insecticide?
Have you ever been accidentally exposed to any kind of germ spray? In particular, an insecticide, a great deal of insecticide.
Insecticide?
Exactly. Has there ever been a time when you were so exposed?
Yes, about 2 months ago.
I was on my way to the store through a back alley. As I was walking, a truck turned in. It was spraying trees.
What Matheson is doing there is so inexplicable in a way, because he has already written a scene in which he shows us a character being exposed to one thing, but then before even revealing how that is relevant, he brings up this thing that we have not even been shown happening. It's all recalled from the character's memory. And then the doctor explains what the significance of that is.
Do you think that's what's causing me to?
No, that was only the beginning. Have you been exposed to any type of radioactivity in the past 6 months?
That day we were on the boat.
The boat?
Charlie's boat, remember?
Well, yes, I remember. The mist. That mist.
It's not the fallout itself necessarily that has given him this shrinking disorder. It is rather that the fallout or the radioactivity has reacted with the insecticide that is already in his system, and as a result, he's basically breaking down at a molecular level and just shrinking precipitously.
Yeah, it's one of the interesting things where now we're looking at interactions between something that happens and then the radiation again. So radiation is still or something. We don't know if it's radiation.
Yeah, radiation.
We know it's something, but
yeah, it's not. And that's another thing about it is that it is technically a science fiction movie, but just like the Robinson Crusoe-esque survivalist last act, there's really more sort of allusions to fantasy. Like the way the cloud is depicted is almost like a magic dust. It even like glows on his skin after he's been exposed to it. It's almost
like
it is,
body glitter.
Yeah,
like
it is
on your body.
Yeah, it is a much more fantasy derived image, or at least that's how Jack Arnold realizes it. I don't necessarily know if that was Matheson's original intent. I think you're right that Matheson is exploiting a very common motif of the movies of this period, which is, of course, the threats of nuclear proliferation and radiation affecting ecosystems and human beings. But
and it's also over water, so we're looking at the atoll kinds of.
Yeah, so there's
bombing,
definite explicit
allusions. So you have this
allusions.
thing going back to the H-Man again. It's sort of like when you think about it.
Yeah, there's definite parallels to the H-Man here with this sort of uncommonly... Because again, the radiation isn't just making a monster. This is a movie about modern technology, and specifically technology of warfare and ecological control. In the case of the insecticide.
Right, so it's unintended consequences of the interaction.
Right,
which is one of the first movies that really brings that out.
And specifically its effect on people.
Right.
The extent to which the bomb is a formulaic device in the story, Matheson also problematizes the apparent exceptionalism of the bomb. It's almost as if the insecticide element is shoehorned in order to problematize the obsession with the bomb, to say, no, there's plenty of other aspects of how human beings directly influence the environment and then reciprocally affect what it means to be human that cannot be boiled down to just whatever, some bomb wakes up a giant monster or creates a giant spider or something. It's a much more...
Right.
Almost more critical, because then like with the H-Man, I think, it does become a systemic critique rather than the bomb as a boogeyman. And actually, he, at the end of the movie, in his closing monologue, he does speculate on the possibility of other people becoming shrinking men, of other people, that he will no longer be the exception, that other people will follow him. And he does refer to radioactivity or the mists, the strange mists that he encounters.
I was continuing to shrink. To become what? The infinitesimal? What was I? Still a human being? Or was I the man of the future? If there were other bursts of radiation, other clouds drifting across seas and continents, would other beings follow me into this vast new world?
But implicitly, I think, as far as Matheson writing it and in interpolating that element of the insecticide, it could be it's also implying a whole other host of possibilities. And a lot of and as opposed to this one where he does find a certain peace in becoming so infinitesimally small that he just becomes part of everything. Yeah. There's lots of way, way worse potential consequences that are going to afflict other people.
What choices does he have, right? He's shrinking. So, but it's interesting that there may be people like him. It'd be interesting to know whether he thinks that, you create a whole other world of shrinking people that become this unity of intelligence, right?
I mean, that is a kind of science fiction.
Yeah, if anything, the arc is about creation, right?
Yeah.
From the Big Bang, and now he's deatomizing, if you will, or
it's almost like a anticipation of 2001, where the character goes through this barrier of time and space, and he emerges on the other side as this completely new being, which is neither fully individual, but also not totally assimilated into just this cosmic vastness. Right. It is this distinct conscious energy almost. But I am interested in the way Matheson not only presents us with a scenario in which, yes, modern technology is going to wreak irrevocable damage, because while he finds solace, it does ruin his life. It does create unbearable emotional burdens for his wife. Mm-hmm. It does make it so that he's dependent on everybody else. And those same people, but for the grace of God, could go through exactly what he's going through. And so there is that element that Matheson lays in there, which is that, yes, he finds solace, but the systemic problem isn't going away. It's not.
No.
That hasn't been solved. If anything, it's pushed entirely to the periphery, as you described before, as Carrie just runs away and escapes into even further into his home and avoids society altogether, avoids going outside, and avoids trying to interact with people. Again, I guess I have to return then to the metaphorical potential of the movie, of this guy who is escaping into this domestic space because it's the only place where he can escape from this horrible society from which he's totally alienated. But ultimately, that is where, for all intents and purposes, he does die.
Well, he dies outside.
Well, he literally dies, but this is where, when after he's attacked by the house cat, basically after his own pet has completely turned on him and just views him as prey and a toy to be played with, she comes home and finds his discarded tiny little shirt on the floor and assumes that the cat has eaten him. So it is interesting, I think, in that way, that that's what I mean by all intents and purposes, that he is, to everyone else, it's no longer about him being ignored by society. It's just his shrinking and his escaping further and further into this domestic hiding place makes him basically effectively dead to the world.
Since we already came right around to the end of it, other than the actual technical aspects of the movie, I think that like you said, most of it is really if you take it away, the actual instigating circumstances, that it's basically a Robinson Crusoe.
Well, it becomes that.
Yeah.
It goes. Yeah. It kind of transitions fairly seamlessly from being a melodrama to an adventure movie. That's the weird thing about the climax, because he effectively dies, or at least to everyone else around him. He now is determined that if he is going to be this small, that he basically decides he's going to be the ruler of his microscopic domain. So there's all this stuff where he uses tools and he uses his ingenuity to try to master the environment around him, culminating in a epic fight with a spider over a piece of bread.
Cheese. Isn't it cheese?
Oh, yeah, it might be cheese. Over a piece of cheese.
Because she puts it up top of the thing. She's making a mousetrap, right?
Yeah.
She's putting the cheese
up. Yeah, his wife is making
a
mousetrap.
Right.
And there's
a lot of technical beauty in this picture. When he strikes a match, he grabs a match and strikes it. It's absolutely amazing, the kind of stuff that they put into it. Or floating on a pencil to save his life from drowning.
Yeah.
There are a lot of little touches in the movie that are remarkable. You look at Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. For some reason, this is so much more. Well, first of all, it's more.
Well, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids takes place mostly outside.
I know, but still. But you get the point.
But no, I think that
the miniaturization. They have the honeybee. They have to go right. The honeybee.
Right, but it's not a survivalist story.
Well, it is in a way, isn't it? Because they have the scorpion and they have the.
Well, it's a coming of age story. That's what Yes. It's about the kids bandying together and trying to work to survive.
Right. Get back to the house. Right.
Whereas I think the domestic framing of this movie, even as the world is more expansive, as he's shrinking, there's still this claustrophobia. There's still this sense of imprisonment. Even the adventurous climax of the movie is very uncomfortable and constrictive because he fails so many times, or things just go completely wrong. There's this, like you referred to, the scene where there's a flood in the basement, but to his wife and his brother, there's just a leaky pipe somewhere and a clogged drain.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's floating on this pencil in the water and just calling out to them, and of course they cannot hear him because his voice isn't big enough to reach them. And then as the brother unclogs the drain, the brother and the wife leave the house, and then he just floats on this pencil and it spirals towards the drain, and he doesn't fall into the drain, but it's sort of implicit of just his abjection is now totally complete, that he's never going to get his former life back, that it's over. It's an adventure story to end this melodramatic film that I think doesn't lose its melodramatic core in a way. It's not yet about him conquering something. It's not yet about him conquering his new life. It's about him facing up to his total dehumanization in a way.
He has to use his wits to survive, right?
Yeah.
In an environment where he is handicapped by the fact that he's shrunk so much.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of advantages to that. You can hang on to a piece of thread, which is your rope. He learns that in his world, he's accommodating to it.
He can adapt.
He can find ways to accommodate or to adapt to the circumstances, use his wits to survive. First thing I do is got to find food. And we have to get rid of the spider, right? Yeah. The spider is going to be
the only threat to our control of the resources.
Right.
It's a very... in a movie that is about this middle-class professional everyman who is turned from the sort of ideal of a productive, wealthy, or at least modestly wealthy breadwinner and head of his house, who then becomes totally dependent on his wife and the help of others, so that he's almost like a child. He's not like a child, but that's certainly how he feels about it. And then to shrink further and further to the point where he's now... It's almost appropriate that it does become this Robinson Crusoe-esque fantasy, because he almost takes to this now primalistic, uber-masculine way of reasserting himself and find, not just to survive, because I don't think it's just about survival. I think it's as much a fight for survival as like any fairy tale is like a fight for survival. It's as much a fight for survival as Jack killing the giant is a fight for survival. It's also definitely also a hero narrative, but as opposed to like the fairy tale of Jack the Giant Killer, we're seeing all this hero narrative just from the outside, so it allows us a unique way of seeing someone whose motivations are so bound up, not just in merely surviving, but in proving to themselves a kind of mastery, as it were.
I still had my weapons. With these bits of metal, I was a man again. If I was to die, it would not be as a helpless insect in the jaws of the spider monster. A strange calm possessed me. I thought more clearly than I had ever thought before. As if my mind were bathed in a brilliant light. My legs trembled, not with fear, but weakness. Yet somehow I felt within myself a new source of power. A giant strength, urging me to the death struggle.
I think one of the topics that didn't come up in the movie, obviously he only can accommodate to his environment.
Yeah, he can only continue to adapt.
But at some point...
at some point it's meaningless.
At some point, if he gets too small, he won't be able to.
Yeah, you do wonder why he hasn't killed himself.
Well, the point is that he would have died. I mean, the idea is that he wouldn't...
it's inevitable.
What isn't addressed, and I thought was missing in the movie, is his concept, well, I better act now because I'm right at the size where I can move these scissors. that's not really brought up to a point that if he shrinks too small, he's going to get killed by the spider.
Well,
it's almost as if the challenges that they have are freeze-framed in the fact that he's not shrinking anymore. And he is shrinking. And the point is that at some point, and I thought it'd be interesting if they would have wrote it into there, he could have, even though he's talking to himself, well, I've got to act now because at some point I'm not going to be able to. Well, I may be able to be better on the paint stick.
Yeah.
Because I'll be lighter, but I'm not going to be able to
or
jump.
Or whatever he does, whether it's using a nail to trip a mousetrap in order to get the cheese.
Right, but he may not be able to pick up the nail if he gets too small. So the concept was that I think that's one thing that was missing from the movie is that would be good if he thought about it. Geez, if I continue to shrink, I got to act now while I have the size that I am. I can if I get any smaller.
But that's what I'm thinking in terms of. I think it speaks more to the direct characterization of Carrie that even at this point he's not thinking in terms of what will happen when I shrink next. He is strictly, and there is a really great scene where it's before he kills the spider, but he has ascended to the top of the window where the cheese is, and he goes up. He's not quite small enough to get through the screen mesh over the basement window. So it is this image of him still being a prisoner, and a similar sort of thing happens.
Yeah, of course it's a bird, and the bird's usually in the cage, and it's vice versa. He's in the cage looking out to the bird.
If anything, that would be a perfect place for him to realize, eventually I'm just going to be so small that I can walk through this thing.
That's the only thing that I think that is...
But he never thinks those things.
I know, but it'd be cool.
Even at this point.
Yeah, but it'd be cool. All this, I'm trying to say, if I were thinking about it, painstakingly, the kind of detail these writers went through and all the work that went to create the set pieces and the miniatures, I mean, it's really remarkable, I think,
and it was a fairly low budget movie. Universal International was not one of the major studios at any point in this period, and they did produce a lot.
That's the only thing. That's the only drawback.
But even by their standards, this was a relatively cheap movie.
Because that's what I was thinking in my mind. But this is all post hoc. It'd be cool if, after seeing it, that if that were part of his mental capabilities. Because yes, he has to get food, but I got to operate now because at some point it's gonna be useless. I'm not going to be able to pick up the bent nail with the rope attached to it to fling
Use it as a
grapple.
Hook. Yeah.
As a grapple, so he can
ascend,
climb
mount dresser.
Right, mount dresser or mount with box, whatever it was with the slats. So I mean, it's just absolutely a wonderful movie. But that was one thing that I thought would be really cool. That knowing that his own realization that he's shrinking. He's continued to shrink. That he's got to operate now. This is the time where he has to do it. Maybe it's implied by virtue of the fact that he has to kill the spider.
If I was to win the food, then it must be now while strength remained. While I was still of sufficient size to scale the wall. It was not decision that drove me to the crate, but reflex, as instinctive as the spiders.
Because he realizes
no, but this is the thing, is that, I think that would lend itself to a little too clinical an approach to the story, because what I do like about it is precisely that fact, that he is driven to kill the spider totally by his new consciousness, not as a person who is shrinking,
right,
but as a person who is the size that he is.
Right.
And so, that's the thing that I'm saying.
Sure, I get the point.
If anything,
but that would exist anyway. I mean, regardless of whether that piece were added.
But it's not. But that's the thing. It's not the proper point to introduce that realization. That's why it's necessary for him to kill the spider. And what happens in the movie is he goes to claim his cheese, and then realizes that after he's finally conquered his domain, as it were, he's not even hungry anymore.
This was the prize I had won. I approached it in an ecstasy of elation. I had conquered. I lived. But even as I touched the dry, flaking crumbs of nourishment, it was as if my body had ceased to exist. There was no hunger. No longer the terrible fear of shrinking.
He finds that he shrinks even more and he walks through the screen, and that's when he finally actually accepts that, oh, I am gonna just keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and there's nothing I can do about it. Whereas that's what I think the significance of that adventure sequence is not actually him achieving something, but rather it's almost
buying time.
Right, exactly. He's just buying time and doing all of this stuff, and it's just protracting the inevitable. It's meaningful to him, but it's because it's not bound up in actually reckoning with what his condition is.
Right.
Just like his, just like the melodramatic scenario leading into it, where, escaping into his house and just hiding from the world, which is exactly what Clarice says to him, which is that, hiding away, isn't gonna change anything. It's not going to make you better or the world better. So you might as well come out of your hovel.
Different. That's another way of saying alone, isn't it?
Oh, but you're not alone now. Still, it must be hard to forget the way things were.
Yeah, I'd like to burn it out of my mind.
Maybe the best way to begin is to start thinking about the future.
A future? In a world of giants?
I've lived with them all my life. Oh, Scott, for people like you and me, the world can be a wonderful place. The sky is as blue as it is for the giants. The friends are as warm.
I wish I could believe that.
You've got to believe that. Don't you?
Yeah. Give me time, Clarice. I'll learn.
As the coda to that story, this adventure conclusion to a melodramatic story, I think what it becomes about is sort of, this is another version of him escaping, except now it's even more egoistically driven. It's now even more microcosmic and totally insular, and he's completely alienated from any notion of I'm part of a world.
But then he realizes he is part of the universe. So.
Right. And he only gets that, after going through all this stuff.
Right.
I think we're finally getting to it, which is to say that there's a way of viewing this movie not as a typical either science fiction or adventure movie, but as an existentialist work.
Mm-hmm.
Where
absolutely. And like you said, I mean, you laid it all out. I mean, there are a lot of arching themes, and we could go list down them, the ones that you just talked about. One, the middle tier people with
the sort of
Cape
middle class
Cod houses,
white everyman,
right? The boat and the house and the car.
Specifically, specifically a man. Like like I don't think it's possible to extricate this story of this man's complete humiliation.
Well, he even tells his wife, you might as well think about us because I'm shrinking.
Yeah, you might as well get a divorce now because you know where this is going,
but
and I can't
they both make realistic points. She says, no, I love you, and that I'm not going to give up on you like this. And he says, well, you know what? You married me as me.
Right.
6'2" or 3, whatever he is. Not 6 foot, not 5. He said he thinks that his whole being, and I think both of them are right. I mean, it's a shame to say that, but that's the human experience. I mean, how many people cheat on their spouses when they have cancer? You could go down a list. She says one thing, and they're both right. They're both correct. And he says that you married me at 6'2", and that's my being. That's what you married, irrespective of what you feel in your heart.
That's going to change.
So maybe, yes, it's right. It's a man's point of view. Size matters.
Yeah. Well,
right?
No, absolutely.
You raise that
absolutely.
point somewhere.
It's bound to... right? But that's what I mean, is that...
masculinity and size.
His crisis isn't just bound up in what's going to happen to... His crisis...
But there's some truth to it.
Right. Well, there's truth to it in the sense where he's giving her the out, where he's saying, it's because I love you that I don't want you to go through this. Whereas as his crisis...
Or his selfishness, too.
Right, exactly. That's what I mean. As his crisis increasingly develops,
right.
Again, his anxiety is completely... It's not even really reckoning with the fact that he's going to maybe die from this condition. It's his obsession with not being a freak and not being gawked at and not being seen as a normal or a real of being dependent, of not being a real man.
That's right. Dependency is also laid out in this film.
Yeah,
and these are real. It's
definitely
a metaphor, but these are real life situations that are like that.
Yeah, the existential crisis and it is a midlife crisis movie almost.
It is.
It's almost like the science fiction version of It's a Wonderful Life, where with the same exact thematic arc of a man who feels like they are increasingly being trapped in conditions that they can't control, who end up lashing out against the people who love them, but ultimately come to realize that they're part of something beautiful and greater. But in The Incredible Shrinking Man, I think it's so much more rarefied in its focus on masculinity as being so essential to Carrie's ability to see himself as having any dignity, as being a part of something.
Right.
And I do think it's an astute way for Matheson to approach the story, whether it's conscious or not, because I think it really does reflect a lot of notions of masculinity have incredibly deleterious effects on both the physical and psychological well-being of men, particularly as they grow older and find themselves sick and find themselves needing to depend on the kindness of others, especially at the time in which this movie is made, in a culture where there is this very large impetus on men to be the breadwinners, to be the controllers, to be in the top professional position. There's an intrinsic hierarchy to how masculinity works in our society, and it's not untrue that precisely because of that, men are less likely to see doctors if they know that they're sick. They're less likely to tell others when they're experiencing physical pain or emotional pain. There's all of these ways in which masculinity culturally influences men, and I guess that's another way we could unpackage the movie.
Clearly he's very successful because does his brother say something to him, because the brother's the head of the company.
Yeah.
And he says that account went through, et cetera, or that account's really important, and I know you're...
Or at least his brother is being a liaison between him and the company.
Right. Well, it's his brother's company, because when he's in the house and he's the size of a kid, he says, we lost the account.
Right.
So we lost 40% of our income because we lost the account, so I can't afford to send you checks anymore.
Right.
So what are you going to do for money? And he said, well, people will pay for this article on you, so maybe you should just go ahead and... Everybody knows now it's going to come out sooner or later. Why not get paid for it? Right?
The truth is, I just lost the Bannister account. You know how big that account was, probably 40% of my income. Well, it's gone now, and I just can't afford to send you your paychecks anymore. Look, I don't like to say this, but... Well, there have been some reporters over at the plant. Looks like somebody at the medical center talked about you. I told them there was nothing in it, but one of the reporters stayed behind. He was from the American Press Syndicate. He said they might pay for the story, if it's true. Scott, the story's going to break anyway, eventually. So whether you make them pay or not, they're going to make the most of it, so make them pay.
No, Charlie.
Well, think about it.
So it's kind of an interesting story all around. It does tie into what you're saying about the 50s and Mad Men, right?
Yeah.
The post-war mindset, right? Women that were working during the war went back to being the housewives and child rearing, and the men went back to work and things like this. So we're looking at 5 years past the war, and it was really a heyday. for the baby boom generation, et cetera, et cetera.
Although interesting, Carrie and his wife don't have a child yet.
No, and they're married 6 years, I believe,
yeah,
right?
That's very uncommon for the time.
That is very uncommon. Right.
So maybe that is, again,
didn't
with
seem
Matheson's writing.
Seem like masculinity came up at that point, did it? And now he's worried about it because he's shrinking.
This is what I'm saying. Like, I think this movie really does lend itself to a lot of readings, and the idea of Carrie's entire sickness, or whatever you would call it, that it's a metaphor for the totally dehumanizing effects, not necessarily of radiation or insecticides in the environment, but of the cultural environment of hegemonic masculinity, where it's like, you've been married to your wife for 6 years and you still don't have a kid.
Oh.
Like, we could easily see those things as being symbolically represented, that this is that it's not a coincidence that Carrie is the one who becomes fantastically or incredibly affected by this rare phenomenon, that there's little bits of detail in the character, in his characterization and the characterization of his relationships that suggests that that he's already at a point where he's not a quote real man.
Right. The idea is, but he never really comes up that way. But it's kind of interesting now that he has the double whammy. So,
like, if you were to remake this movie, there would have to be a scene where the characters are making love, and he realizes that he can't please his wife anymore because he has a completely different phallus.
Right.
It comes to a head and that's what I mean by the adventure part of the story. That's where it really comes to a head, because it's almost as if there's a collision between the existentialist themes of the movie and also what appears to be its metaphoric dealing with hegemonic masculinity, where existentialism is basically, to boil it down, and I'm certainly no expert on philosophy, but basically from what I understand existentialism to mean is that it's a school of thinking which emphasizes, just as Matheson's story does, not simply the human being as a behaving entity, not as simply something that is action-oriented, but is also a discrete, intellectual, and psychological being, and who moves through society. And existentialism emerges from the Enlightenment and from modernity's challenge to the conventional conservative authorities of the church and monarchy, of these establishments that are based in superstition and appeals to higher spiritual authorities. And as modernity comes to challenge and ultimately replace those things, it does create what I guess is commonly known as an existential crisis, because the more that society can be reduced to rational instruments, the more it can be reduced to simple empirical observation and decoding, the human being themselves finds themselves in a predicament where they slowly realize that, it's not just the old forms of power that have gone away, it's that, as Nietzsche had put it, God is dead and we have killed him. That there's nothing special about human beings. We're just evolved animals on a small planet in a vast universe, and that the universe itself is kind of cruel and absurd, and that there is no God who is looking on us with a benevolent gaze, that we really are on our own. And so once you reach that point, the existential crisis becomes, well, how do you achieve any sort of meaning? Is it even possible to achieve any sense of meaning? And in existentialist philosophers, they would promote the idea of the individual rising and basically disciplining themselves to focus on creating their own meaning, and to not simply accept modernity, but to even go beyond it, in a sense, to something that comes up in existentialism a lot is this idea of self-actualization or authenticity, where it's only once someone recognizes and faces up to the fact that the world is vast, cruel, and absurd, that you can also realize that, well, then, if it is vast, cruel, and absurd, then I'm just going to create my own meaning, and I'm going to defy whatever stands in the way of that. It's a way of attempting to square the circle of how human beings can find spiritual meaning in their lives at a time where the entire spiritual dimension of human reality is being foreclosed by modernity. So I think it's apt that The Incredible Shrinking Man, unlike a lot of the films that we've seen, the monster movies or the alien invasion movies, it's appropriate to view it as an existentialist film because this is an even more heightened state of modernity that is occurring in the context of the post-war and the Cold War period, where obviously the bomb still looms large. You know, it's one thing to say that, okay, there's no God, so what meaning is there in life? But it's another thing to say nations are amassing these world-ending weapons. So what's the point? How can anyone really go on knowing that these catastrophes are just around the corner?
Or when the Earth is ready to face catastrophe, like War of the Worlds.
Right.
Those are existential movies, because
well, that's the thing. I think they're involved.
When you say an existential threat, you mean a threat to your existence. That's all it means.
Well, that's the thing, is that threat to existence is not merely threat to survival. Threat to existence is also a threat to the spirit or to some sense of dignity. And I think you're right to bring up War of the Worlds, because I think where in that case the threat is of alien invasion, and in this case the threat is of environments
colliding
being affected by human beings, and modernity completely altering what it means to be a person. I think it's appropriate to bring up War of the Worlds because they do have that parallel in that the conclusion of War of the Worlds is that earth-bound bacteria and viruses ultimately, inevitably kill off the vastly technologically superior Martians. Actually, I don't know if it was in Wells's prose. I do know the movie ends with it, where it's sort of attributing that to the work of a god, which is basically as contrary a answer to existentialism as you could get. You're almost, in a way, rationalizing the vastness and unpredictability of the modern world in terms of reaffirming almost irrationally a sort of prime mover or a divine benevolence behind it. And in The Incredible Shrinking Man, when he does shrink to his smallest point and he has that final monologue, he nonetheless also speaks of God, of how to God there is no zero, that he's not really he doesn't really perceive the universe as vast and cruel and absurd. It's quite the opposite. He sees in its vastness an intrinsic benevolence.
So close. The infinitesimal and the infinite. But suddenly I knew they were really the two ends of the same concept. The unbelievably small and the unbelievably vast eventually meet, like the closing of a gigantic circle. I looked up, as if somehow I would grasp the heavens, the universe, worlds beyond number, God's silver tapestry spread across the night. And in that moment, I knew the answer to the riddle of the infinite. I had thought in terms of man's own limited dimension. I had presumed upon nature that existence begins and ends is man's conception, not nature's. And I felt my body dwindling, melting, becoming nothing. My fears melted away, and in their place came acceptance, All this vast majesty of creation, it had to mean something. And then I meant something too. Yes, smaller than the smallest. I meant something too. To God, there is no zero. I still exist.
And I'm wondering if that, in a way, it is like War of the Worlds, and it is like It's a Wonderful Life, where I wonder if that doesn't make the movie a little bit schmaltzy, in a way.
No, I think the dialogue is it's okay. I mean, it's not the best written soliloquy, we're at the end, but it's all right. I mean, it's just, it's okay, I think. It is schmaltzy to some extent, but not a lot.
I guess the only thing I would add to that is it's not just a thematic failing, it is a dramatic failing, where it's like, I really love this movie a lot, but I think Matheson does such an excellent job of setting up this existential crisis through this character whose idea of how he achieves dignity is bound up so much in what are, for the time, the conservative ideological norms, whether it's economic position or race or your gender or your size. And he does such an excellent job of taking this character through the ringer and basically eventually bringing him to the exact position where he has this kind of mythopoetic reclamation of his masculinity in this Robinson Crusoe-like adventure, but then he pulls the rug out from under you completely because, of course, as you referred to before, he is just going to keep shrinking. It's weird that there's technically no point to the climax. And that really, I think, does speak to the existentialism of the work. It's this persistent recognition that even though he has done this amazing thing, he still hasn't found an authentic meaning because he still hasn't recognized the inherent fact. You are going to die, you are going to shrink, and there's no inherent meaning to your experience. It was just your private interior experience, and you're literally dead to everyone else. But then in the end, there is still this one irrational holdout, which is that the benevolent God in Carrie's worldview is preserved. So even as he accepts his inevitable fate and finds solace in it, it has to be rooted in this idea that it's almost like a heaven. It's almost like a non-theistic heaven where he becomes this being of pure energy. Whereas I think that there's a fair critique that you could take from an absurdist point of view where, in fact, no, it's precisely the opposite. That even at this point, this isn't an authentic dignity because it's still so bound up in a very quaint, almost euphoria. It's almost like he hasn't really shrunk to the point where he's become part of the universe. It's like he's dropped acid and he's laying in the flowers or something. I don't know. So really, basically, all I'm saying is, I guess I just found that I just find that conclusion, I guess, a little bit insubstantial now versus when I've viewed this movie progressively throughout my life, whether it was as a kid or then as a teenager. I guess there was a time in my life where I was particularly apt to accept that very euphoric ending, but whereas now I'm kind of in a position where I feel like even that euphoric ending is kind of a
cop-out.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah, because the existentialism only exists. Existentialism is really just organic. I'm sorry. There is no... Human beings are best adapted to put time in for a legacy. A body of work.
Yeah.
They know that when you die, you're not going to be able to look back and say, "Oh, look how everybody's enjoying what we've done."
Yeah, and you can't really, and that's
the
thing.
thing. If you tell people
maybe you can have a euphoric ending, but maybe it's better to just, I don't know, because then you might even just be setting yourself up to fail.
Maybe it's supposed to be a cop out. The point is
well,
that...
yeah. I mean, again, it's like It's a Wonderful Life. And like, you know, the movie takes you through this really very compelling and dreadful experience, but the conclusion is the total affirmation of this fairy tale.
But I think he raises some point that when you disappear to nothing, you don't, you become part of the continuity between infinity and the infinitesimal, right?
Right.
That's what he says, right? And that's true. I mean, the idea is that...
Well, that's the speculation.
The dark... Well...
But I'm saying that... But as it's presented in film form, it's presented in this euphoric way, yes. Which I don't think is...
Well,
like, you could easily imagine a much more ambiguous scenario where you see the character experiencing this, but you don't hear the narration.
It's like
you just see, like, I would love to see a version of this movie with no narration, honestly.
It's like, exactly, or just not narration, but he has to be thinking. But the idea is that, I mean, it's like think of the existential qualities of Men in Black, where at the end of the movie, it zeroes away from Earth, and Earth becomes zeroes away from all the...
Okay, but here's the thing.
All a bunch of marbles, and they pick up all the marbles and throw them into a bag.
Right, okay, but here's my point. Men in Black is about an American covert intelligence organization that polices refugees from other worlds. It's like, this is what I'm saying, is that, like, there's an ideological binding.
I know, but I mean, the ending is kind of funny when you think about it.
It's funny, but and it is...
That someone's playing with us, that there's this vastness beyond us that picks us up like a bunch of marbles, throws it into a bag, and we don't know that we're being thrown into the bag.
But that's exactly... I think that's exactly what I'm saying. That's the postmodern inevitable end of what we see telegraphed in The Incredible Shrinking Man or in War of the Worlds, because obviously all these... there is a legacy to these sorts of movies, and I do think that Men in Black ending, that's the inevitable end game, where it's like, we're all just marbles in a bag, but it's presented in this sort of twee or affected way where you sort of realize that, Scott Carey has not become a star child or anything like that. He's almost the vicarious, he is the vicarious everyman who takes us through this cathartic experience where the point is precisely that we reaffirm even more deep down the world is good, deep down the world is ordered and benevolent, rather than really achieving a kind of self-actualization of saying, okay, the world is cruel and absurd, but that doesn't matter, because all that matters is that you're a person and all you can do is worthy of its own meaning. And you can find these meanings in certain ways, and, a different existentialist or absurdist might say, one would say, oh, it's just by being your own man, and another might say, oh, it's by giving to others. But obviously, I think it's evident that The Incredible Shrinking Man gears very directly into one very hyper-individualist direction, and very honestly masculine and class-oriented. So that's all I'm saying, is that I found that aspect of the film a little disappointing on rewatch, but we should not detract from the fact, just like It's a Wonderful Life, another movie that I find myself increasingly disappointed by the ending as I get older, nonetheless still thoroughly enjoyable and expertly written, I feel.
Yes. This is a well-done movie. Absolutely. Yeah. This is like not as good as the Quatermass Experiment, but it's good. It's a good film.
I can guarantee that in the future we'll definitely be trying to watch more of Matheson's films. We kind of have to, because just because he's tied so much to Roger Corman, but we'll definitely be watching more Jack Arnold films. All the ones we listed off here are pretty much, as far as I'm concerned, essential, that we're not really going to really get a good grasp of this survey without acknowledging him. So he really might be the first real auteur, well, I guess besides Irving Yeaworth, he might be really, or Ishiro Honda, he might be the third, actual auteur we've actually encountered watching these movies, because he did seem to have a very prolific period where he made a certain type of movie, and a lot of those type movies that he made, they're very diverse.
Right, they are.
what have we learned today, Rocco?
Nothing. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'd already kind of grown used to the idea that the universe is a vast and absurd place.
Yeah, I don't know. I can appreciate the challenge that maybe the only authentic meaning is one we make for ourselves, but that's way easier said than done, so I guess I don't even try.
I won't worry about it too much. Meaning is kind of overrated anyway.
You think so?
Well, let me put it this way.
Oh, I see what you're doing.